Hello everyone, today we briefly address the development of infantry firepower doctrine from the War of the League of Augsburg to the War of Spanish Succession, comparing chiefly the French, English and Dutch army. As we will see, the French army in particular had delays in the doctrine of employment of, say, greater and more sophisticated forms of firepower, relying more compared to the opponents. And so in this sense, a bit with all sort of the most updated Western armies at the time, on cold steel. This is a very important passage because, as you know, we are at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, and if period in the modern era deserves, if any, the term of revolution, which is definitely a despicable one, it should never be used. In this sense, well, we should look at the second half, especially of the 17th century. You realize that the French army, by scale, power, managed to assert its monarchy as the hegemonic continental power, like literally taking a massive step further in the development of the art of war. I made some videos about the army of the Sun King that really was a great innovator in anything except these more technical issues, that the French army had essentially a longer time introducing chiefly like the major, say, firearm technology after the granulation of power. That technically, at this latter end, is not even technically a firearm technology per se. It's the bayonet, the introduction of the socketed bayonet that allowed still some counter cavalry capacity, but still allowing for some fire. We'll see this also talking about, we'll quote later actually a passage looking how the French themselves were gradually introducing this. But overall, right, in looking at the size, the enormity of the French army itself had been rendered more complicated, just as the uniform training for rank fire, for example, and different levels of, say, small unit tactics as far as the musketry fire, say, volleys were concerned, which instead the English and the Dutch, that at this point, as you know, are also under the same monarch, because especially the latter, their peculiar political and strategical circumstance of having to hold against that, and next door, literally, that giant that Louis XIV France really was, and that were quite rich, and at this time were actually the strongest army in history in terms of like a strictly economic cost-benefit ratio, right? Had to, in fact, implement this further, this tactical finesse. Admittedly, they had also smaller armies, which, for reasons that are really obvious in the history of technology, of innovation, because it's not having the technology. Of course, France had it, but implementing this for the entire army, and so developing as a consequent an adequate doctrine, even before that this could be, say, this armament, different armament and sort of administrative and mental cadres could be even homogeneously applied is another story. It's just like saying, I don't know, the US are currently the only global power, militarily speaking, and as such, they can really move an enormous force with great effectiveness. And obviously enough, their army, taken in that sort of actualization in interest of quality, would be much lower than, say, I don't know, the Belgian or the Australian armed forces that, in spite of being excellent, doctrinally speaking, in terms of quality and equipment, couldn't sustain, of course, that type of war that their their doctrine itself is designed for normally, all right? And that, of course, would need protracting in time and in space. They should bring the quality much down, together with the costs and interest of even power. And of course, in the 21st century, we are sort of all much more different from one another. In many ways, it's strange how that you understand how that lack of strategic culture actually substantiates itself when you realize that people are so hyper-fixated wargamistically on the differences between, I don't know, ancient or medieval armies, and they make an enormous deal about that, and they don't even look at the macroscopical, radical, structural ones that exist, of course, in much more complex and developed civilizations like today, right? And it's useless that you make the joke that I, cover much more ancient and medieval history. That's just because of my fields of specialization, and not because actually I don't like or care, or actually, really enjoy just learning contemporary warfare. In fact, just yesterday we finished our series about Overlord, and as you understand also with this video, we're getting a bit more, towards the present times in the chronological line. And now, why is this topic important? It is for a number of reasons that will be clearer when, especially we look at single battles, right? Just for this period, we talked, for example, about the Army of the Sun King. We talked about the Battle of Malplaquet, for at least a question and answer video. We talked about the the strategic, the military culture of the French armies from quite some time. We looked at the Battle of Freiburg of 1645, where honestly, as a military historian, I was deeply impressed how early those were. Condé's soldiers were not wrong, but the French infantry, so I'm not a random commander, was that incredibly stout, aggressive, determined, and well drilled, trained, evidently. In that case, actually, against an enemy that was, yes, there were the barbarians, were the Catholics, like those Bergic side that was much less, advanced in statehood, etc. And that, however, were in defense, right? And that in those 3 days out of 4, like the French basically steamrolled, like from storming all the fortifications. Aside from the last day, it was a bit the culmination of it all. The Germans retreated anyway, and that was accomplished, but with that, in fact, straightforwardness, and needless to say, very heavy casualties, right? Because assaulting, frontally trenches, even in the mid 17th century, was not really much of a pleasure. And there are actually lots of very interesting episodes. The Battle of the Assiette, we'll have to cover that against the Piedmontese. There are lots of circumstances in which really the French displayed this incredible confidence and a sense of, essentially of moral superiority. We've seen how at Malplaquet, even suffering heavy losses, they didn't disintegrate against these armies that were led, by the way, we're talking here the age of Marlborough and Prince Eugene. And of this very qualitative ones, especially the English and the Dutch, at this point, especially also the Austrians in terms of command were not bad either. That and were essentially gapping that divide that we're talking about for, in fact, Freiburg, so a couple of generations before, and that we're able to take those heavy losses in this sense, paying for some missed opportunities in that circumstance of Malplaquet that are not sort of just coincidental, right? They are part of some systemic issue that derived exactly from what we were talking about before. That is, that in the art of war, doctrinal developments and in part also the technological ones. Always remember that it's tactics that make weapons and not the other way around, right? If it does happen, it happens for a minimal degree, and this is extremely clear to anyone who has an idea of the history of not just of science but also of economics and so on. In spite and being, of course, closely related to one another, displaying this lag time, right? That does not depend, in fact, on okay, now we have a deterministic teleological necessity of now investing on this, say, technology, right? Because if the context does not actually seem to provide you with the conditions even to graft that increased firepower, effectively, what's the point of that, right? There isn't, again, technology is something that should never be remotely seen as anything coming anywhere close to a major factor in the outcome of a war. Like, we can make the sense that, yes, a tribe of savages will be wiped out by, at this point, European firepower, but that's because that's a tribe of savages, right? And so it's kind of obvious that it cannot withstand the might of a colonial power. But at the same time, like, it's not even true that wars cannot be won or lost in between. Like, Europeans at some point were defeated also by incredibly backwards peoples, and we're not talking about, I don't know, just the Italians against Ethiopians that actually were not just not real savages, but it also had some, in fact, armament provided by some concurrence of Italy. But we're talking about real, like, primitives, like it could be in, most areas of the Americas, of Africa during the 18th century. And because, of course, obviously, also that European power was not in that given place, that the more savage it is and the less relevant it is, could be concentrated and overwhelming. So, of course, when somebody fights wars, it's always because there is a chance of realistically winning them and or obtaining what you want politically from them. This is a completely different topic. It's just for saying that, especially when we talk about the Flemish battlefields during this period, we're looking at European powers that are fundamentally the same, and that in this also can be like more easily studied as far as these minimal differences and how they played, exactly because the basis was practically identical. And so what stands out is this minimal differences that, however, you shouldn't give this immense importance to. And if anything, you should read instead in function of what that military system as a whole, as the actual Leviathan is, as opposed to whether they used the Bayonet or didn't, which has practically no relevance in the bigger scheme of things. Now, it's atypical for a new weapon and a new tactic to be adopted at the same time. It does not happen, right? It almost always happens that a new weapon system is used and employed according to the use that has been made of the previous armament up to that point. And this delay is determined by a couple of reasons. Like, the first one is that the distribution of the new weapon, especially in large armies, does not occur quickly and uniformly within the various units. And if you have an idea from those videos on Louis XIV's army that I made of, say, the giant size of the French military development and power display at this point, you realize that, of course, what the greatest concerns of the French were all but say, oh no, we don't have uniform muskets for our units everywhere in France. That has nothing to do with it. This in part has nothing to do even probably with the field armies on the front line, right? Numbers at some point, as von Clausewitz also tells us, are sort of more important. They're not decisive per se. But again, there is no factor that even remotely approaches individually like the 50% plus one. And so even historically and scientifically, we do not have the exact quantities of how every factor played. Nor there is a radical swing between them. I mean, you can't count, 20, 30 factors. You don't have actually the quantities of that. Warfare is mostly a matter of moral forces. You can't quantify mathematically moral forces. You can just sort of perceive them or touch them when you study military history in a diachronic and comparative way. That's why I was impressed for Freiburg as far as the French infantry was concerned already at that early in time, because that's something you would imagine. Just the Sun King was not even a king, of course, was just 1-2 years old at the time, right? So the various reforms of the French army had not yet kicked in to the degree that would make the French military of that more famous level later. But this tells you at the same time how the army of Louis XIII of Richelieu was already, like Mazzarino actually at that point already, was sort of relevant, right, in compared to specific opponents. Those were the same years of, Rocroi, and, there is a lot going on, and warfare is not that easy. Like, there are so many different encounters that you also don't study really all together with a bit of, familiarity with the sources, with the political and strategical context. You're not going to go very far, right? So that's why actually historiography could do much better. There is so much to dig into this stuff. I would have liked to study modern history, but I also am content as a medievalist to stick to a time in which you still have such relatively few sources. It can actually be quite many, and so wondering also how is, like, if actually medieval warfare properly has not been studied truly that well in a diachronic and comparative way, what about modern history, even more contemporary history, right? There are major sort of macroscopic events you can't sort of easily pinpoint in time and space, and so like making 2 + 2, and that's not a bad way of going. You should always understand the essentials, right, before starting from details. But at the same time, you need both, right? And that's how you build up a solid military historical education. Now, speaking of the same factor, why, of course, weapons and tactics do not actually develop at the same pace, is that it takes obviously time before, especially in complex systems such as an armed force, before the mental and administrative conditions are able to launch a deliberate program of change. Which is kind of obvious, because imagine just not having even the material possibility of uniforming your own units. You cannot even develop aside from the military experience that arises, and so the true art of war, like out of sheer practice and coup d'oeil and military intelligence and more, you get quite, let's say, know even how that army would work, right, until it's complete in that direction. And armies sort of always change over time too, so that we're not, and we technically never are at any point in military history, the point in which you say, well, yeah, there is this doctrine, so this theory essentially of how you should employ your armored forces, and I'm sure that this is how it's going to happen whichever war, or in any war, or I'm going to get, right? That's not real, right? And that's why you need always look at current wars if you're not part of them, sending observers, etc., which still doesn't mean that, again, that will tell you exactly what will happen in the next war, because it won't, right? And people are strangely, we all know why that happens, but say fixating on technology to an extent it is really disturbing, meaning if in a war a particular, say, drone was so effective. You see how in Ukraine, for example, things have changed dramatically. It's a big It's a big war, and of course things change, but they change on the basis of Russian and Ukrainian strategical needs, right? That's not something that can apply simply, right? I don't know, in Syria, for example, in the same way. And that, when I say the same way, it really entails an enormous, difference in the practically the strategical operation tactical level, and so how the armed forces must be organized and trained and armed in order to cope with that still sort of question mark that nobody really knows how it would really play out. And this is sort of the beauty of war, among other things, because it always keeps you that has to keep you that awake, that sharp, that sort of curious and flexible, because that's exactly what the situation is, right, on the field. I consider that it's difficult for us even to track exactly how armies were developing for the 19th, the early 18th century. Imagine for the future, right? And or even just in the same years, in the absence of a sound historiography and sort of review and, scholarly consensus and so on, which may also be wrong, right? As it's been, look at the concept of the military revolution, as that we were hinting at before. Finally, there is something like a greater resistance to innovation precisely in those armies that emerge victorious from a war compared to those who have been defeated. This is crucial in history. I mean, look at my avatar and you know the story, right? If an army does well, like in this case, the French had actually been very good up to this point. What was the point after all of saying, okay, we have, especially with the sort of extremely difficult condition in which France found itself, admittedly not differently from other countries, but let's say this was, again, an enormous system, that there were, 3-4 revolutions that risked to break out under Louis XIV, exactly because also of the military blows that the French army received at some point. Like the generals of Louis XIV managed to spare Paris from foreign boots, like Napoleon once failed instead. So that there is all like a history behind that hardly has to do with the type of weapon that they are using, that basically is going to be the same one still, in essence, that the enemy has, say, more or less updated model, right? And so there are other factors that you will also invest in at the moment. The French army, for this reason, proved to be very reluctant, more than other powers, to finally pass to the, say, to lines constituted essentially just by musketeers. Which means, of course, not even the adoption of a weapon that was already there, rather the proportion that we'll see better in a while, say from the beginning of the 17th to the mid-18th century, between musket and pike. The pikes wouldn't even properly and completely disappear from the battlefields, even at the peak of the so-called linear tactics, for reasons that we will explain. But of course, the proportion with musket would change importantly. It's also a matter of ranks, files, and also of organic, and how these guys are trained. So just think about all this factorialized mathematically. You cannot even calculate it, right? It has to be tested, right? And still, again, the French are over-reliant, especially on cold steel. That is the other alternative, right? So what you can see in hindsight would have not been the future, right? But that still objectively had been working and still could cause problems among the enemy, right? I made some videos about the same French army towards just after the 7 Years' War, and the the Grand Querelle, right? All the doctrinal debate concerning that were actually happening also in other armies regarding still, and we are in the full 18th century after the full development of linear tactics, so to say, of line versus column, right? So obviously cold steel favors the column because it has to sort of break through, it has to advance fast, so with a narrower front and just breaking through a line that has to be, in that sense, at least in order to cope against this charge, thicker, right? But in that sense, sacrificing firepower in the process. In 1693, the same King Louis XIV had hoped for a complete abandonment of the flintlock musket by his soldiers. Right? So this was, just think about this in historical perspective, and also from the opinion of a guy that was quite fixated with army's reforms. He had created the same mighty French army of the era, and so it was not just the last of the military minds, even though he was not much of a commander, as you know. And the reason behind this, of course, was cost in many ways. The conservative nature of the Sun King and his Minister of War, Louvois, together, in fact, with the enormous expense needed to rearm the entire army with flintlock guns at a cost of, by the way, 14 livres per piece compared to 9 livres for the matchlock, blocked the spread of the former weapon among the ranks of the armée until 1690, right? So not much a prejudice, technologically speaking, but a necessity to the current needs of just the French army, the French state. And the battlefield would soon demonstrate, even to the most skeptical, however, the potential of the new flintlock. At the end of the War of the League of Augsburg, so as you know, we are between 1688 and 1697, French infantry was still superior to the Allied counterparts, right? As you know, Europe at this point coalesces largely against France because this alone can tend to hegemonize the entire continent. And French infantry's reputation or especially superiority had remained intact. Therefore, no major changes were made to innovate tactics. In spite of the increasingly massive use of the flintlock, and at this point also of the socketed bayonet, which would have also, let's say, been functional for the same French infantrymen. Firepower seemed at this point, however, to be the most important element, or at least the increasing one, in the, say, volleys exchanges of how tactics was generally developing towards from the Allied side, so particularly the Dutch and the English, who were surely working much harder than the French to increase the effectiveness of their infantry's shooting. This aspect we will analyze in a while, but you understand what's the point. These guys are mostly on, not necessarily on the defensive, but overall, like they are smaller, closer to the giant, right? They have smaller armies. They tend to, they're also living a moment of particular, prosperity. Economically speaking, France is, say, the bigger system that overall is, as we've seen, less competitive in interest of, say, individual elements, but has really the bigger forceman side. So it's obvious that the Allies at this point would invest mostly in the quality of their armies to compensate for their numerical, if not numerical inferiority, but still the fact that there were in fact also a bunch of different armies together, individually smaller, and so not even progressively trained, like to act together. Of course, war in many ways in Europe had been a matter of coalition, but the French had also the advantage of the unity of command as a state, as a monarchy. Now, the increase in the firepower of the infantry had made the clash between the two opposing formations a particularly bloody affair as far as properly this shooting exchange was concerned, right? You can't say that historically speaking, like this was necessarily a bloodier, less bloody engagement than before. When you actually study medieval armies, people say, "Oh my God, they were bloodless because there weren't firearms." I tell you, as as a PhD in medieval warfare, it's complete and utter BS. But I mean, big time, and not because look, in this battle there is a greater bloodshed. No, I'm talking systemically, right? Medieval battles were extremely bloody. And the entire BS comes from the myth that chivalry was allegedly just, not killing people or not killing noblemen. And complete and utter BS. And I can't reinforce this. So you can't really say that even in a particular time, like what does happen when, because most of that would be like a product of the collapse of an army rather than else, right? So it technically doesn't make sense to say, was this a more or less bloody overall affair, like as a battle, than the one in other times. No. Here we're not saying that the increase in the importance of firepower meant that battles were bloodier. Right? Battles were bloodier, as would happen in this circumstance, especially in the War of the Spanish Succession, because there were an enormously and as unwieldily incredible amount of troops concentrated in a single point, killing one another, right? And the way armies kill one another depends on how much you want to rip the guts off the person in front of you, not what you have in your hands, right? So here we're just observing, isolating the shooting, the firepower, the infantry could deliver individually. And so saying this was of course increasing as much as muskets were increasing over the pikes historically, etc. So here we're saying that firepower had never killed as many people as before. This doesn't mean that battles were per se more or less bloody in relative terms. Of course, these were also bloodier in absolute terms when you consider the fact that armies this size had never been fielded, right? It's literally like from especially the beginning of the 18th century, there is actually an increase in quality that actually makes the numbers, the size of armies dropping. It's not until Napoleon that you have armies of hundreds of thousands of men, right? So the reason is not firepower. The reason is that there are two sides, peoples, major forces in Western world that want to destroy one another. That's the reason why people are killed, right? Not much the fact of how they are, by which technology they are killed, right? But it's obvious that this technology was becoming handier to facilitate in that context, and the combined arms capacity, cavalry had sort of come back on the art of war, even though it had never really disappeared, artillery, right? And so in a way that was ever more functional in that sense. Consider that in linear tactics, the element that kills more in combat proper is musketry fire, right? And so only secondarily, like cold steel, and artillery is literally the last thing. It was not probably even meant to kill lots of people. It was mostly meant to shock them, right? To scare them, to disorder the formations willingly, rather than physically killing people, right? Compared to, they did that too, of course, but they, and also scientifically, but there is no comparison numerically with musketry fire, right? And so it was obvious that at some point, like, the firearm technologies would have helped the increase in army's power, armies based on infantry, and so of course that lines of musketeers. Since in such a context, serious losses could not be avoided from firepower, it seemed to the French theorists that victory could go to the unit capable of maintaining its fire discipline intact despite the carnage that was increasing with each volley, right? This is an interesting take because they weren't simply lured into the fact, okay, we simply must, again, implement things technologically. We have to invest on training, on how troops are deployed, how the units are organized, and ultimately how they behave on the battlefield. We've seen in multiple videos how during the early modern era, that was literally a new way of training soldiers that paradoxically cost per soldier much less than it had been the case before, but that invested in fact in the collective side of the story. The continuation of loading and fire movements without being too upset by the losses, right? And the maintenance of the formation were more important themselves than the volume of fire expressed, right? And they were actually right? And this was also understood by everybody at the time. Like, nobody at the time, like the mentally feeble that we are today, believed that technology solved problems per se, right? Because it never did. By the most overwhelming degree, the problem was how you handled this technology, and therefore what kind of preconditions you sort of you could avail yourself of. Now, soldiers, and I made a video about 18th century discipline, how they were literally trained, right? It was a very frenetic thing, right? The point was not actually increasing, say, accuracy of the individual trooper. The point was being able to mechanically repeat without, let's say, distracting oneself, the loading and firing movements before the unit would go entirely disrupted, and so that fire cohesion would eventually collapse. So if you force soldiers to repeat this over and over and over again and fast, of course you would first of all actually decrease accuracy, but you would maintain a at least minimum volume of fire on an enemy that at the end of the day, in the chaos that unfolded in battle, including the fact that nobody saw anything in front of them, so they would have had to have just a general idea where the enemy was more or less located in the smoke, would actually make the difference in those protracted engagements that linear tactics was producing. Thus, it was mostly a matter of stress endurance, if you want, rather than any technical finesse, right? And soldiers, no matter how well trained, armed, and determined to fight, would be, in fact, erratic agents of death, in the sense that unless they are directed towards a specific objective and are, say, engaged in particular tactical situations, they often illogically choose their targets. You know this pretty well. They open and cease fire individually, are distracted from the targets themselves by enemy retaliatory fire, obviously by wounds sustained by even just the man next to them. They are subject, of course, to fear or elation. They may fire too high, or too short, too quickly, too frequently. So to prevent all these influences and tendencies, and to try to avoid accidents in the close formations of the period, because they would at some point actually shoot the people in front of them. This internal order in the unit had to be safeguarded at all costs. And in fact, again, aside from the type of musket, what literally the art of war interrogated itself at the time was, how the hell do we deploy troops in a way that they can, and of course also how we train them and organize them for that purpose, so that they actually don't lose that order, so that they don't, they're able, victoria, at least to maintain that minimum continuation of firepower that we were pointing out before. Some other authors argued that French infantry was sort of unreliable in defense in these years, while showing instead its best by assaulting the enemy with bladed weapons. This is also not a correct idea. It's based on at least the oversimplification and misinterpretation of battle reports. Again, there is I made multiple videos on this. There's a theory of the art of war that is sort of becoming something relevant in history, but that actually does not apply to the reality of the battlefield. And the same generals who wrote this stuff, mostly out of, writing their memoirs, for example, we've seen it for, Maurice de Saxe, if you're interested in the French army of the mid of the 18th century. Fontenoy is kind of, that would actually behave differently in their own, even from their own precepts, because everything varied on the circumstance. And again, still at this time, people writing this were just sort of stating opinions rather than having to be, believed 100%. And this was true also by themselves. But there was a reflection also in Doctrine stemming from these sort of questions, because there wasn't really even a technical scientific measure to this, right? And so the debate arose. There was a profound influence exercised in this debate on 18th century French tactics, as we were talking about before, concerning the Grande Querelle, still that much later in the century. The oversimplification and misinterpretation of the French being weak in defense and strong in attack derived approximately from what we were observing before, that the French tended to, at least at this point, rely more on the column, just the tendencies of the proportions between width and depth of the front compared to their opponents, because we've seen how even, for example, in the Prussian army, a better infantry, meaning a morally stronger and a better trained one, was of course better to take on the enemy with bayonets and cutting them to pieces like that. It was much more directly effective and destructive than just that sort of weird exchange of volleys with people not even really seeing each other, that would take time before actually wearing out the units. And it's sort of like a more logical principle. It's something that was believed, for example, before World War I, regarding the necessity of breaking through at all costs and so on, and understanding humans, hopefully, as sort of some superman, at least at the highest of their capacities. And since the French, as we've seen, still had it in that aggressiveness, it was sort of easier for them to attack than the Allies. I say the Allies, talking here about the English and the Dutch in general, just because we're comparing them now. As you know, there were also the Austrians, etc. But we'll talk about those in another video. Conversely, since this, say, column formation naturally entailed sort of a deeper, a greater depth and a narrower front, this meant that the French firepower was considered weaker. And so if they were to be attacked, meaning that they were not to counterattack, to attack in general, they would have been sort of more unreliable because they would have taken more fire, at least from, at that point, from, in fact, armies like the English and the Dutch ones that had been investing more in firepower and that therefore would take on the French in a sense backwards in that respect, and not, let's say, firing back at enemies more effectively. Now, this is a very interesting concept because, again, 18th century art of war, we've seen it in different circumstances, was all between this back and forth, in spite of the fact that still linear tactics ultimately prevailed. You do find columns charging successfully, etc., but the general Western armies that were pretty much all alike in the essentials at this point in history would essentially all fight with a line, and just less frequently resorting to the column. But still, the idea was, but what if we organize this column a bit better? Like, it can solve some problems and whatever. So this is how the prejudice was maintained, even for some peoples. And there are lots of these ones that we find even in the later historiography, right? All these armies were actually much more similar than we think in general regarding this doctrinal affairs as well. In fact, and finally, in 1699, the French army adopted the flintlock musket, and in 1703, the pike, at least for the troops, and temporarily we'll see it now, was abandoned, right? I say it because there were still at some point some units equipped with pikes, but for reasons that we will have to explain later. Now, in 1690, on the Italian front, the use of the pike in particular had proved almost completely useless due to the terrain, which was mountainous or interrupted by woods and canals, and so in these contexts, cavalry found numerous maneuvering difficulties, making the use of this weapon system superfluous, which at least was true for the warfare of the time that had sort of more hammering firepower, and so the pike was finding itself sort of more or less at ease, paradoxically, during the Italian wars of 150 years before, as cavalry was more powerful and firepower less effective. But we will see, we still have to talk about the Italian wars. There is so much about early modern warfare that we need to cover in depth for the history of the art of war. Now, in May of the same 1690, the French units destined for the Italian front had a socketed bayonet with a tubular coupling. There is an interesting account from the first battle of the Balsiglia on May the 2nd, 1690. I talked about the Valdensians in another video, what kind of guerrilla warfare were successfully carrying out against the French, and the same author of the Valdensians noted that if we're talking about mountainous areas, and so in May it still snowed, and so if there hadn't been snow 15 minutes before the attack, the French would have caused great trouble. He puts it in this term, I mean, they would have really beaten the Valdensians hard because these French soldiers all had that type of socketed bayonet that did not prevent them from shooting when it was fixed, right? And here the French actually failed the attack against the Waldensians. The forces involved were 6 companies of grenadiers, some regiments of that were the Artois Bourbon that had only 1 battalion. Here, battalions at the time had normally a couple of, the regiments had a couple of or 3 battalions, and some of these were under strength. They had the Duplessis-Bellière, the Vexin, the Cambrésis, and Lassard, the latter one being also 1 battalion only. This is for saying how, at least some sources point out that, of course, like in this case, it's the weather that makes things failing, right? Naturally, it would have been the terrain, it would have been the forces involved, but you realize that even with all these forces involved, the attack fails. And yet, the Waldensians from the other side feared these weapons that allowed the French to shoot and stab at the same time. And we are in 1690, so the French finally got there. And we should make some videos explaining how these weapons were eventually distributing to the troops, to various units across all fronts, right? These were, again, this was the southern front, and the way the armament was issued, something complex. In any case, once the bayonet was fixed, the musket became, and what's the point, a real pike, right? So they partly, it was not as a pike, because it was just 1 meter 90 centimeters long. But let's say, given that firepower had increased, this bayonet was fixed on the pole, that is the musket, could further compensate for that lack of pikes, and so making musketeers more insidious for cavalry, right? Still, the infantryman's equipment was, however, completed by a double-edged sword, right? In fact, you do find among the various depictions, etc. So these guys were meant, of course, to engage into hand-to-hand combat. The passage was not so tranchant, right? It was something gradual over time. Or for the grenadiers, a curved single-edged saber. The elite soldiers and corporals were armed like ordinary infantry, while the sergeants were equipped with a halberd approximately 2.5 meters long, known as sergentin. Junior officers, lieutenants, second lieutenants, and senior officers had an esponton, a semi-pike between 2.5 and 3 meters long. Pole arms, while of some use in hand-to-hand combat, were to become at least more representational than functional, right? It's really untrue that these weapons were not used because hand-to-hand combat was rare, right? It was, of course, less frequent than before, but as we've seen, especially with the French, it wasn't just there to a piece of a relic of the past, of antiquarian purpose. They were literally functional to hand-to-hand combat. For the sergeants, however, they also served as a tool to keep the men aligned, right? Bring them back into the ranks, to push them towards battle. In fact, being there to kill the guys. And if, of course, if they retreated, and if the enemy would have come close hand, there were the bayonets after all. So there was a reason why the bayonet existed that you should always point out for, say, why did armies of the time have bayonets if, melee would have been allegedly rare. It wasn't rare, telling the truth. Now, there is an ordinance titled Exercice pour l'infanterie de France et autres mouvements réglés par la main de Sa Majesté, le 2e mars 1703. This was published in Paris in 1704, deciding that all the infantry should be armed with flintlocks. However, the tactical arrangements of the battalions in 5 or more ranks was still the same as a unit armed with pikes. This is curious because you understand there that the older mentality of having a formation more suitable for hand-to-hand combat, right, rather than a firefight, was still present among the French. And this was not just an accident, was not okay, well, they were mistaken in issuing that. No, right? It still meant that hand-to-hand combat capability was still strong and alive. As we saw, the War of the League of Augsburg had shown that the flintlock enjoyed, at least in mere terms of fire performance, a notable tactical advantage, as it was safer to ignite and reload more quickly. This fact suggested increasing the firepower of the infantry battalions, so exploiting the technology that had been in part required, that sort of more attritional warfare. So let them advance, we'll shoot at them, and so maximize, if anything, while they approach, the fact that they can't shoot while they are advancing, at least as much as we can do by defending. And so we will invest, as English, as Dutch, in this. So these armies would instead lengthen the battlefront and reduce the thickness of the infantry battalions. The French still continued to use the standard formation, based on 5 ranks, even if the weapons had changed, right? Because they counted, or their infantry doing something different on average than the one of their enemies. Now at this point, so again, the War of the League of Augsburg, we are essentially in the 90s of the 17th century. The French battalion front measured just under 120 meters. Every battalion was 690 men, subdivided into 13 companies. On the right, there was the Grenadier Company of 50 men, the Colonel of 46, and 11 companies of 48 musketeers each. On the left, there was a made-up company called the Platoon sur la gauche, which stands for platoon on the left, made up 4 men taken from the first 4 companies and 3 from the remaining 8, together with 2 sergeants and a drummer. And the reason was, as you know, that while advancing, this formation had to maintain, of course, the right axis, and having stronger units on the flanks, respectively in this case like the Grenadier Company and this other company made up of the best men of the other companies, was the answer, was also a privilege in many ways. We will see this at some other point better. Now, a distance of 4 paces, 3.65 meters, was to remain between the ranks, so the various companies, for a total depth of the battalion of a bit above 17 meters. In case of lack of personnel, however, the French could be lined up in 4, 3, or even 2 ranks, right? So as we will see now, the English and the Dutch would do something more drastic. They would essentially get on the 3 ranks formation, firing just like one guy kneeling, the other over their head firing and the others reloading, and so alternating, trying to so thinner lines than the French ones, but this doesn't, on average, right? It doesn't mean that the French, in fact, could not be under strength and not having actually even a thinner line than the Allied one, right? So that's the sort of like, this was a tendency. It was what was written on the let's say on the ordinances, etc. But what happened in campaign, in battle, could be very different. In any case, that concept, that greater depth of the French formations remain. Only starting from 1706, the possibility of deploying in just 4 ranks was granted, with a battalion front widening to 148 meters, so substantially reducing the depth, increasing the width, and relying more on firepower. We are at this point during the War of the Spanish Succession, fought between 1701 and 1713, and the aforementioned formation size would remain the tactical standard during this period. 2 systems of fire were devised for battalion ranks or for companies. In the first case, the first 4 ranks of the battalions knelt, while the last rank fired while standing, then continuing successfully up to the first. In company fire, the 3 front ranks fired, with the first kneeling, while the last 2 act as reserves. As we will see now, the English and the Dutch had, so conceptually it's always the same system, but they basically will invest more on the rotation of the single ranks firing, so to put up like a more homogeneous fire across the line more repeatedly. Because when you looked at these deeper formations, the problem is that even if you could have this first ranks firing, then the others doing so, etc., the fact that there were more, that they had to also interlock multiple ranks, the fire, etc., meant that it would have actually taken more time to fire like this, and so would have ultimately ended up the French being exposed to that greater firepower. So actually this derived, because as we've seen before, for the fact that the French army was much bigger and it was more difficult to uniform it to those training standards, which would have been compensated just by their size, by their also, as we've seen, tactical proclivity and formation disposition to charge, right? That was the thing that would have compensated, in fact, for this lack of firepower. All this could mix up itself during combat, because again, the conditions in which like all these nations fought on the battlefield as single, let's say, infantry lines could get so messed up that would have held cares what kind of doctrine they really had. But conceptually, that's how still the French went, right? Aggressively attacking most and being predisposed like that. And we can actually, in historical insight, focus on how this developed over time from the beginning of the 17th to the mid-18th century. So we're looking at the beginning in a time in which the pikes were prevalent, right? So that we know, like from the different dates, what kind of the order really was. And this had always developed with, we've seen it in the videos about pike and shot warfare, like the pikes in the center and the musketeers on the wings. All right. At the beginning, at this period, there were still arquebuses somewhere. The terminology also could be very imprecise. In any case, by 1622, the French battalion, the pike and shot proportion was 3 pikemen for 2 musketeers, and the depth of the formation 10 ranks for company, right? For depending also how these were combined, because there were at that point sort of multiple lines. You know that in linear tactics things literally tended to be just one line in the main as the main battle line, right? So at that point just only those 3 men, which however had enough firepower to hold it and maximizing in fact that choice of firepower also to try to outflank the enemy at the extremes like this wider line. Around 1630 the pike and shot proportion was 1 pikeman per musketeer. So you can argue that in 1630, like the French had already reached sort of the turning point with the prevalence of the shot, right? And the formation was now 8 ranks deep. Like this was thinning because, of course, if you, as we just explained, if you increase firepower, you need also to have it available. You need the guy shooting, not having anyone in front of him, right? So to have that firepower maximized, because you can have again this alternated fire of the various ranks, but still like this doesn't have to be too deep, because if these guys can sort of also reload in time before the others have unloaded their guns, like you're wasting that immediate firepower that you need, and that you will tend to use in volleys that are being more consistent, could do more damage to the formation, even at the parity of shots fired in the same amount of time, but gradually and not all at once. By the mid-17th century, we have 1 pike for 2 musketeers, and the formation was still the same, like with the pikemen in the center and the musketeers on the flanks. The formation is 6 ranks deep. Around 1680, you have 1 pikeman per 3 musketeers deployed on 5 ranks. Now we are approaching our times, because in 1695 we have for one pike 4 musketeers, the depth as many as 5 ranks. Now, by the beginning of the 18th century, during the War of Spanish Succession, we have, as we've seen, still the 5 ranks, but the pikemen do not exist anymore. Right? This is interesting because, of course, you have like the linear tactics, they're fully accomplished. Now, interestingly enough, by the mid 18th century, you have a proportion. Everybody is pikemen, right? But in between, right, the companies, we have actually some NCOs, etc., that have to maintain some sort of the solidity of the line. And for this, some sort of cold steel is reintroduced. Bear in mind that here, like the bayonets are there, so it's not that let's say that hand-to-hand capacity has disappeared. Actually, in some cases, has now enhanced the same firepower, and even the defense of the line. Even though this has thinned, and that's why 2-3 ranks. So the idea is that you have all these junctions that must be stiffened, because of course it's difficult to make the wider the line is, right, the more difficult it is to make it advance at the same height, right? And so you need some joints that fundamentally allow that cohesion. As we understand here, finally, French infantry tactics were an anachronism. Yet, I don't believe they were so costly as we think. Like, they were costly in terms of abstract technologistic, backwardness and lack of interest in developing, say, an adequate doctrine of employment, but again, it's all about how the French army was essentially habituated to work and to succeed at the same time. This did not even depend just on the strategical, say, from the tactical circumstances. It was about strategy, of course. It was about politics, as we've seen, just equipping all the soldiers with weapons that would have been very expensive, but in that sense would have in part even been lost in their use because there was no adequate doctrine of employment for them, as the units could have not been homogeneously trained in that way. For French standards, was not really a big deal, right? The most serious deficiency in this all remained the relative inability to make the most of the firepower of the individual battalions, that, however, could be compensated by a greater aggressiveness, right, and sturdiness that you can argue, like, yes, that would have eventually been molded down by the general increase of firepower that was finally adapted also in the French army. It was top notch of its era as an armed force that you have to consider in that optic, right, in that perspective. So the company fire, the only one that guaranteed continuity of fire, witnessed 3 ranks and the possibility of shooting against the enemy. The most used combat system remained fired by battalion ranks, a solution which during the War of the Spanish Succession was essentially becoming obsolete and would have had fixed. Right after the initial volley, the entire battalion had to reload, remaining at the mercy of the enemy. So again, it was not even a problem of weapon, it was how, like, the units were collectively employed. In that, as far as that firepower was concerned, the fact that too many men were to shoot at a time and waiting for the others to do the same, so that in interest of, say, of absolute quantities, this would waste more time compared to the Allies that had developed something different. At the same time, however, these battalions were sort of more difficult to break through. They were actually more prone to be outflanked. That's also true, but they could also punch back in a very hard way. And still, we're talking about armies in which, of course, there was all cavalry, artillery. I think the video about the Battle of Malplaquet tells you, for example, like that passes, oh my god, the Allies could do this and that, but it's actually the French that could do much more, right? Had they had a different, quality, homogeneity, right? And that at some point was also not just the troops' fault. It could be that the commander that wouldn't see like an opportunity arrive, etc. You can't say, oh my god, that things went in those ways just because of this doctrinal issue. No, right? And we need to be a bit more humble in this sense. There was also an initial fury of the French fire action that would, because of the aforementioned issues, lost its continuity and effectiveness faster than one of the Allies. So confusion, losses, non-functioning weapons, disbandments, the piling of soldiers on top of each other. This was a problem for everybody involved, right? And as we've seen in the other videos about 18th century training, managing that fire was rather difficult, right? It was mostly like a mechanical process that at some point, yes, the officers could direct, but just mostly that moral sense, like just showing that they were there and giving confidence to the troops, and the rest was just dictated on so many other factors, like did the troops eat, what kind of weather there was, what kind of ground they were fighting on, could be so many different things. So quickly losing coordination and speed was in firepower like a common problem. The French were qualitatively worse at it, but there was also a broader counterbalance. Then again, it's not just about this aspect. Now, speaking of the English and the Dutch briefly, because we actually don't know too much about that. About the French, we're actually more knowledgeable. But we will talk better about the English and Dutch armies in detail in some other video. Now, the Dutch followed by the English because they were the ones, as we've seen, that were more directly pressured by the French, and then the Dutch stadtholder became also king of England, and so everything was, as you know, just in part mixing, not actually entirely, but still like by imitation. It was, as we've seen also in the previous generations, this idea that was a sort of Protestant ideal of war that was being imposed here too. It was not even true because they had the Catholic Habsburgs next to them as well in common, but in general, like these two countries were close, not just geographically, right, but politically, culturally, and more. And so the Dutch would first very quickly re-equip their army that, as we've seen, had the advantage of being, say advantage, but disadvantage in the sense of being smaller than the French one, right? So they, if they had decided just even to field more troops, which was not just their policy for different reasons, the English were not feeling so directly threatened by the French, but they were starting to make a lot of money, so they could, in part, like increase the quality over the quantity. The Dutch were historically not even sending their own nationals into the fray. Like they had essentially a mercenary army, and they were incredibly attentive, as effective, again, the greatest army in history under this specific point of view, to the economic costs. The Dutch have at this point the strongest army in terms of like how much money you invested for a single soldier and the actual performance of the single soldier. And we're talking, of course, collectively more than it, right? But they're as businessmen and financiers, they are extremely and also because they're overwhelmingly pressured by the French that are literally invading their country. They have to break their own dams to stop this kind of tragedies. Like, so they are incredibly driven, they have the means, and they opt for like a compact army that, however, has increased the quality of firepower, that in a defensive position, as we've seen, that's the same thing that we were pointing out for the French in Italy. They had abandoned in part the pike and sort of this also offensive capacity because they were fighting in places with canals, with broken terrain. So Italy is different from the Netherlands, but there are at least some parallelisms for terrain. And in defense, you can actually profit. You can camp, right, to put it banally, but it's not literally, again, that thing that, also because the enemy would not get himself killed to that extent. We're talking, again, the Allies, as you know, even coming to threaten the same Paris. There was only one French army between that and the Allies, who were quite desperate moments as well. But that's where the French actually showed that also in defense could be pretty tough after all, and that things would balance out after all. It was a matter of balance, just broadly speaking, not just tactically, but as you know, strategically and politically. And you know, if one say if the threat was fading, also the alliance was, right? And so even the troops concentration and the entire fort was redimensioned. So that's a bit the history of those times, as always. As the English and the Dutch have the smaller contingents with Flintlock muskets as early as 1692. All right, all well sort of homogenized in armament. The English, for their part, began to modernize the infantry armament since 1688. Right, in 1697, the operation undertaken by James II had not yet been completed. Since 2/5 of the infantry had old matchlock muskets, and even in 1704, this had not completely disappeared from the ranks, right? So the Glorious Revolution had happened in the meanwhile, and in general it was still like an English. Just before that, it had been, of course, a French-English alliance, but there was all like that. We don't have time to speak exactly of the doctrine that had developed since essentially the new model army, and how the parliament was increasingly invested in that level of unprecedented level by way of expenditure. Things take off only after this point, right? In 1704, 2/5 of the infantry had old matchlock muskets, and even in 1704, these had not completely disappeared from the ranks. Actually, the English weren't that sort of pressured again like the Dutch. They didn't have the same level of of innovation, and this again because they had fundamentally relied on other forces. Think about the navy for defending, but they had been in sort of important wars recently as well, and so this would they would begin to adopt like the new system, like the new fighting tactic known at that point as the Dutch one. This has nothing to do, by the way, with previous developments. We talked about the Dutch drill like at the time of the 80 Years' War. This is a completely different scenario, right? Both politically and strategically and historically, in terms of strategic culture, like the Dutch are doing something else with unprecedented means. As you know, the Netherlands are booming economically, and they can afford this much investment in their military. And having understood in that sense that the main aim of the infantry was to destroy the opponent with their fire, it was necessary to deploy the greatest number of muskets on the battalion front. That was really the challenge. As we've seen, it wasn't much about the guns themselves. It was about how wide the front could be, and so this is a greater strategic principle when you can avoid sort of like we can't hope even to outflank the enemy, to envelope the enemy. This is something we've seen also in the past, like with the idea, for example, that the Swedes during the 30 Years' War had this sort of more fragmented, even thinner formation that they could, even get on the flank of the enemy. Even though this had still like the bulky formations because it could afford, in a sense, to fight like that. So things would balance themselves out. And that's why I'd say in this case France doesn't conquer the United Provinces, or the Allies managed to march on Paris, right? So I think was balanced also tactically. And the Anglo-Dutch came to organize their battalions into 3 ranks only, which, as we've seen, would remain a bit the standard for the following decades, dividing the unit into 18 platoons, which in turn were grouped into 3 fires of 6 platoons each. You understand the math here, right? The regulations required the first rank to kneel, while the second and third ranks could point the weapon by lowering it into the free spaces between the men. So it wasn't even just a real rotation, but this would naturally occur after the first volley. But it allowed that to be much more orderly and to cause, also in interest of literally even of hit targets, more devastating damage psychologically, because again, in the same amount of time, the same amount of fire can be distributed differently, and if you shoot all at once, that's going to have a much more devastating effect on the enemy cohesion than if you again hit the same amount of men in the same amount of time, but gradually, right? So the first rank in this could also fire or serve as a fire reserve in case of need, because as we'll see now, this was also the point. Not much, it could alternate, this also depending on the situation. You wanted either to have this first volley that sort of shot all at once, or you wanted to have always one rank loaded and ready to fire, so that you would sort of maintain the enemy, depending on how this eventually this sort of platoon fire could be organized, in a way that did matter, as far as also like not giving time to reorder, keeping him nervous, right? It was this also this other thing you could even renounce to that salvo sometimes, to, depending on the situation, making the enemy more aware of the fact, oh my god, they're still shooting, right? Even if they shot less, but still in the confusion, like not really realizing what was going on, when to expect the following volley, and so disturbing him psychologically. Because at the end of the day, it's really that. It's not much killing the person, wounding him, like injuring, damaging physically, materially. It is first and foremost about the mind. All right, and as we've seen, the French are easily disordered, as they are doing something at a bigger level that sort of takes more resources. And even though their volleys can be impressive, at the same time they're sort of more concentrated. And if you, at a time, and if you manage to sort of harass them before they coordinate one volley and another, like they're going to be more disordered than what the English or the Dutch can. Again, it's liminal. We can't quite say that this is what happened normally in every circumstance, let's say in a scientific way, in a positive way, but right, it was a tendency that was being pursued by these armies, and tendentially there was some concrete result in that direction. So in the Anglo-Dutch doctrine, let's say, after the volley, the first fire reloaded, leaving the shooting action to the second fire, which was then in turn followed by the third. And in combat, a third of the battalion, in this way, was always in reserve with loaded weapons ready for combat. And this were that immediately expandable, right? The idea was, in fact, not having, even, you understand that the depth was smaller. And so for a single section of the line, you would have to actually fire faster. And this paradoxically was happening because, yes, it was a higher training than the French one, and the French one was lower, but also shot with more ranks, right? Just more slowly, though. So we understand how things counterbalance one another, right? It's rather it's other factors that would bring also the fluidification of this gunnery, as we've seen that the English had their own time adapting to it, right? So it's all something that will gradually kick in the following years for everyone, right? But at this point, the things are adapting simply on the basis of the various needs of these armies for how they have come to be in the first place. And you see, from the Anglo-Dutch side, for example, it was a better control over the troops, right, compared to the heavy formations of 4 or 5 ranks of the French. But we're talking about just a couple of ranks difference, so it's not even this radical change. It's incredibly gradual. The front proposed by the Dutch was approximately 250 meters long, double that of a French infantry unit, that therefore would normally see, like, okay, these guys are more stretched out, let's charge them, right? Rather than taking fire that we are sort of worse at tendentially. So the Dutch would point at a greater number of muskets capable of going into action, whereas the French thought that mass was more important. Here we're not even talking about maneuver, right? Because on the battlefield, these formations would attack one another, and they wouldn't just like they would go into like this protracted firefight, but it could be that again, the French would crush the Allies' lines because they were thinner. Unit fire was better, so there would be lots of it. Conversely, the Allies would, at a point, inflict more losses among the French in the interest of, space, like of that troops concentration, and so also actually managed to cause more losses to also what was a thinner front, and managing even just to envelope them. So it depends, right? It really depends. The characteristics, this as far as the documentation goes, of the English and Dutch regulations began to be known and disseminated only during the War of the Spanish Succession, right? And there are publications like the one in London in 1708, known as the Duke of Marlborough's New Exercise of Firelocks and Bayonets, appointed by His Grace to be used by all the British forces and the militia, which is naturally telling about, especially like the homogenization at this point of technological, right, say of armament, and that for the English that and the French would have adequate themselves, even though that say they were actually doing so, but must maintaining the depth, a greater depth of their formation, because they wouldn't. You see how this is the proof that technology doesn't make tactics. The French were making their own tactics, regardless of technology. Right? They didn't have the necessary collective training to achieve to exploit that technology in the first place. So it's not that they didn't have the technology; they had it. They sort of spread that, at least in a directional sense, more or less in the same time of the English, but they were not to fully exploit the technology, because their own way of making war, their tactics was just regulated by other factors primarily. And I think this is very, very important to understand also how things were sort of balancing out what happened during these wars, and the fact that even if, when you look at the success of the Allies in open field, you can't simply attribute it to the type of fire. Like, there are circumstances in which, yes, we know that they had it better than the French, that had an effect, but if you study the battles, this is about like the various combined arms system, cavalry, artillery, together with infantry, command, like orders, intelligence, whatever. So hardly this very thing. I think this is really important. We will keep talking about this stuff. I have, again, more, of course, incoming on modern warfare. We have to talk more about the 18th century, so the 19th. There is really a lot of stuff to cover. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.